Hello, my wonderful third graders. We are still in Domain 6, the Viking Age, and today's lesson 6, is sagas and swords. That sounds interesting. The vocabulary you'll hear throughout the read aloud: flexibility, capability of bending without breaking. Foe is an enemy or rival. Intently is an adverb, that means it describes a verb. Closely, carefully. Jamie worked intently to clean his room and make sure that everything was in its proper place. Sagas. Sagas are long stories that tell of historic and legendary events. Weld is a verb, something that you can do to make two pieces of metal into one by heating them to high temperatures. All right. So last time we learned about the chores that were part of the Norse people's daily life. What were some of the daily chores Bjorn and Toli had to do at home? What about Kida and the other women? Do you remember? Bjorn and Toli. Toli worked on a farm, and Bjorn helped his dad, but at home they had to help take care of the animals and chop wood. Kida and the other women, they spun wool for clothing and they made food. What is Bjorn's father's job? So he's a blacksmith. What does a blacksmith do? Well, Bjorn's father and brother worked in a forge, right? That's where they worked. A Viking age blacksmith would have made more than just weapons. What kind of things did they make? What do you think? They made nails and tools and horseshoes and jewelry and different things that people need that are made of metal. What did Bjorn's father say they were going to do today at the end of the previous read aloud? What special thing is Bjorn getting today? They're going to start to make Bjorn's sword. Mainly the elite jarls owned swords. If swords were useful weapons, then why didn't every Nordic man own one? Well, they were expensive to make, right? And it was kind of a sign of the fact that you had money, you had riches if you had a sword. As soon as breakfast was over, Toli set off to his uncle's farm. After my grandmother and Kida had cleared and washed the bowls and cups, they went to the back room with my mother and aunt. There they were busily sewing several new tunics. Kida had told me that one was for me and one was for Toli. They were going away presents. Meanwhile, my grandfather and brothers prepared to go hunting and fishing, and I went to the forge with my father and uncle. As usual, I began my working day in the forge by adding wood to the fire, and then used the bellows to fuel the flames. Today was no ordinary day, though. After today, I would own my very own sword. It was not usual for a boy like me to own a sword. Although my father was a carl, able to own land or a business or to fight and trade, he was not a jarl, a member of the elite nobility. Swords such as the one my father was about to make for me were usually reserved for the jarls. I had seen such swords carried by nobles as they arrived in our town to participate in the Thing, our local assembly. The Thing was held outdoors once a year, and it was a time for carls, such as my father and uncles, to sit together with jarls to discuss issues, settle disputes, judge crimes, and make decisions about our community. Even though the carls were a larger group, the jarls had greater authority. It was one of these assemblies that had been decided that 25 young men from our town should leave and go to Iceland. It was at the same meeting that Lord Toki had announced that my father had saved not only his life but the king's life. My father had uncovered a plot that people were planning to kill both Lord Toki and the king. He had overheard two spies talking in his workshop. My father had prevented this terrible crime from happening. To thank my father, Lord Toki wanted to give me a nobleman's sword. Once the fire in the forge was burning fiercely, my father was ready to begin. He had explained to me many times that maintaining a strong fire in which wood is burning to extreme temperatures was the secret to being a good blacksmith. He told me that the iron is only as good as the flames that shape it. Bjorn, I want you to pay close attention to everything I do. You need to understand that making a strong sword is very difficult. It requires much skill, my father explained. I will, I said earnestly. And so he began. I watched carefully as my father bundled together bars of iron. As I watched, the heat from the flames warmed my skin, turning it pink, and before long I was dripping with sweat. I watched my father as he worked carefully and intently. As the iron bars softened and connected, my father used a variety of tools to draw out the metal into the length of a sword. He worked to weld the pieces of metal together. As he pulled and stretched the metal, he twisted it. Slowly, the shape of the sword began to appear. Do you see what has happened, Bjorn? He asked, though I could tell that he didn't really expect an answer. The heating and twisting of the different kinds of metal has created a composite of iron that now has the necessary strength and flexibility for a sword blade. Yes, I see, I responded. My father placed the softened metal upon the anvil and continued to twist, hammer, chisel, and file it into its shape. As soon as he was satisfied with its shape, I knew he would plunge the hot metal into a tub of cold water to cool and harden it. Once the iron had cooled, he would begin to sharpen the blade. Although I did not yet know how to make a sword, I did know how to make spear points, axes, and nails, as well as knives, pots, and pans. That much I had already learned from my father. Father, I have thought of a name for my sword, I said as I continued to watch his work. I wanted to name it Foe Biter. The word foe means enemy. It was common in this time for people to name their swords. My father looked up from his work. That is a fitting name for a warrior's sword, he said seriously. This sword will serve you well. You can think of me and our family when you are called to use it. I stared at the sword for several moments and did not look up. I could feel the sweat and the tears merge into one steady flow of water droplets that fell from my face onto the earthen floor. At that moment, as my father spoke to me, I wanted to stop time, stop it completely, so that I could stay with him forever. For the rest of the day, my father, my uncle, and I worked together in the workshop, melting, shaping, and cooling iron. From time to time, people stopped by to collect something my father or my uncle had made for them. They were paid in either silver pieces or other goods that my family could use. As the day wore on, my father and uncle began to talk about the evening of storytelling that was scheduled to take place in the main marketplace. This was a common practice before special events such as weddings, festivals, or voyages. Poems of old were told by skalds so that we would know our history. It was considered important that these sagas be handed down through the generations and never forgotten. Our town had two skalds who had committed to memory dozens of sagas of Viking history and adventures. One of the skalds would be traveling on the cargo ship with Tolly and me. He was charged with the responsibility of keeping the sagas alive in our new home. Was also a boy who lived on the same street as Tolly and I, who had been apprenticed to the skald. He had already spent many months with him, learning these poetic tales. He too would keep our history alive. So the word saga means to speak or say. Sagas are long stories that tell of historic and legendary events. Maybe you've heard Star Wars movies called Star Wars sagas. So they're long stories that tell of historic and legendary events. And so, late in the afternoon, after eating a dinner of fish, vegetables, and barley bread, instead of preparing to go to sleep for the night, my family, along with many others, made its way to the marketplace at the center of the town. A large fire had been lit, and many people were already seated around it. The two skalds sat upon a wooden platform beside the fire. Once everyone arrived and we settled, the first Skald stood up and began to recite a saga of bravery and adventure. I looked into the eager faces of my family and friends, their eyes lit by the flickering flames of the fire and knew in my heart that this would be the last time that we would all sit together to listen to these ancient tales. Okay. You heard that today was not an ordinary day for Beorn. What made today special for him? He would own a sword. His dad was making his sword. Was it common for a boy to own a sword? No, it was not. Why not? Bjorn's father is a Jarl, and only the elite Jarls own swords. Why do you think Bjorn starts to cry when he is helping to make his sword? How do you think Bjorn is feeling? Bjorn is unsure that he is ready to grow up, and he is sad about leaving his home. What is the name of the Norse people's local assembly? The Thing. It's a funny name, the Thing. Where was the Thing held? Outdoors. Why was the Thing important to the Norse? It was a time that Jarls and Jarls would meet to discuss issues, settle disputes, judge crimes, and make decisions about the community. What does this Norse assembly resemble in ancient Roman society? It sounds familiar to you or similar to the Roman Senate in the Forum. What announcement about Bjorn's father was made at the thing? What did Bjorn's father do that was very heroic? Lord Toki announced that Bjorn's father had uncovered the plot of two spies to kill the king and Lord Toki. He was able to stop the crime from happening. What was Bjorn's father's reward? Lord Toki requests that Bjorn be given the sword of a jarl or nobleman. What did Bjorn name his sword? Foebiter. Why do you think he gave that name to his sword? It was used against his foes or enemies in combat, or it would be used, right? Not yet, but soon. What other items do you think Bjorn's father made as a blacksmith? Nails, knives, pots, weather vanes, figures, tools. Bjorn's father joined others to listen to the Skalds. Why were the Skalds important to the Vikings? The Skalds were poets who reminded the Vikings of their history through the oral retelling of sagas. If your school held a thing, what issue would you feel would be important and or valuable to discuss in this assembly? I'm interested to hear what you would like to say. We could have a Google Meet thing instead of meeting in person. Our word for today is sagas. In the read aloud you heard, it was considered important that these sagas be handed down through the generations and never forgotten. Say the word sagas. Sagas are long stories that tell of historic and legendary events. Have you ever watched a movie or read a book that was a saga? What was it about? All right. Good job, third graders. I thought today's lesson was interesting about Beorn getting his sword. I wonder if we'll hear about how he uses it. We'll find out tomorrow or the next day.